Hello, everybody. This is Ben Kitchings of the History of Voyager, and I'm here with Abby. And Abby has a YouTube channel. Why don't you tell us what your YouTube channel is?
Hi, thanks for having me. My YouTube channel is called Political Psych with Abby, and as you can probably guess, it's about political psychology. Political psychology is the psychology of various political phenomena.
And you were telling me off air just now, your thing is not to tell people how to vote, but why people vote the way they do.
Yeah, kind of. Although a big part of my channel is about, providing political psychology as a tool to activists, right? And
Okay.
I make no secret of the fact that I'm aiming it, at activists for certain causes, but not others, right? I do. I'm not apolitical, if that makes sense.
Well, right. And really, nobody is, honestly.
Exactly.
Well, no, actually, I take that back. You said, because I saw your video, that a certain percentage of people aren't political at all, and that's because genetics, which is fascinating.
Well, a certain number of people don't care about politics, really. That's kind of different. I mean, it's pretty rare for someone to be interested in politics in an academic sense like I am, and then also not care and be, apolitical. That's uncommon. But there are people who are, very low interest, low information when it comes to politics. And investment in politics is to some extent genetic, but there definitely is no gene for not caring about politics, at least not one we know about. And
Why don't what?
Yeah.
I know what a low information person is and a high information person, but why don't you tell people what that is?
Oh, well, I mean, when it comes to, politics, it sort of means someone who doesn't know a lot about the political issues or the political figures involved in something is more low information. And there's a real issue with a lot of political science research where it sort of tends to overestimate how much people know about certain issues. And a lot of what political psychology is about, how people make political decisions, even if they don't have a ton of information about the issues. And there's some really fascinating research about how people with less information can use sort of different strategies to end up voting pretty similarly to people with more information.
Wow, talk about that. That is fascinating. Talk about that.
So I'm sorry, I'm trying to remember a study I read months ago, but it's sort of, it's this idea that people can use a variety of sort of little shortcuts to, if they don't know something about a particular issue, to still, act as if they do. So they'll make a decision for, what side of an issue to be on or who to vote for based off of who else is supporting it, or based off of, what people are for and against it, or so that's the main one that I remember that people use.
Unfortunately there was a cutout there right when you were getting to the punchline, so let's go over that again.
Yeah, I think that there might be some more details and examples here, but I don't remember this article perfectly. But basically, one of the findings was that people are able to decide sort of their political position on things when they don't have a lot of information based off of things such as what other people, interest groups, political parties support or are against a particular position. And I think that the study that it was based off of was a pretty old one about some, I want to say California law about, something to do with like car insurance and lawsuits, and people were able to make their minds up partially based off of where like I think where the like state bar association was on the issue or that kind of thing. This is why I write scripts for my videos, because I don't have a very good memory. Sorry.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Okay, let me ask you this. Let's pull back and talk about your channel for a second. Your YouTube channel. Take me back to the moment where you realized you wanted to make a YouTube channel, first of all.
Yeah. So I had sort of been thinking about it for like I watch a lot of stuff on YouTube, and so I was like, oh, this seems like a vaguely interesting thing to do, and I had kind of already decided that when I was studying political psychology, I wanted to have a YouTube channel about that, because I already had a fair amount of experience with social psychology and other sort of psychology stuff from my undergrad. And I realized that it was really interesting and that it might be very helpful to a lot of people, but that information about it was just not super available and super accessible. I decided to actually create my channel a little bit early because in the last few weeks of my undergrad, the pandemic hit, right? And so there was not a lot to do, right? And I created all the stuff for the channel. You know, I made a header image, I registered it with YouTube, all that kind of stuff. But it took me forever to get my first video out, because I think like a lot of people, I was not, super productive during that, first summer during the pandemic. So I got my first video out September of 2020. Yeah, September of 2020 is when I got my first video out. And then it's just been, making videos from there. I'm in a pretty decent rhythm now where I get one out about once every 1 or 2 months, but starting out, it was harder to get them out on a regular basis. Yeah, but it was basically a desire to share something that I thought was really important and I thought was really interesting with the general public, and also have like a creative outlet in a way. I've always been someone who really enjoys like graphics and that kind of thing, so that's a big part of my channel. I also try and keep it, a bit funny. Plus, what's nice is that, I get to use my degree for it, even though, so I'm not, someone who's in academia, right? And I get to use what I've learned in my degree a bit in my actual job, but not like all the time, right? But I still get to pass on that knowledge and make it accessible to the general public via the YouTube channel, right? So no matter what I do professionally, the degree was not a waste. So that's a plus.
Yeah. It's funny. It's funny is the wrong English word, but it's interesting. I've talked to so many people who have sort of the same experience. Like they have this amazing degree or this whatever kind of degree, but their job is not doing that, and they still want to use their knowledge to teach people, and so that's what they're doing. And then somebody emailed me an article today about how this could actually be the future of education in a very real way. This could be the future of education, that people independently go to stuff like yours and stuff like mine. Eventually I'll pivot back to a historical deep dive if people quit being interesting. I don't think darn it.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that a structured educational system is actually still really important, especially as like a socialization tool and to help people like form bonds in their lives, right? I mean, my master's degree was entirely online because of the pandemic, and it sucked. And having that in person and structured, undergrad experience and, education before that was super, super duper important. And, online education is often very inaccessible to people who have lower incomes or people with disabilities. So I'm very much not someone who believes that all online education is the future. I think that people, supplementing their education with something that they learn online is beautiful and amazing. And I think that is the future. It's also the present. But the idea that you can substitute this in-person and social, very importantly, social learning with online, I think is nonsense.
Well, I mean, I think what the article was getting at was, universities were looking at cost-cutting measures, and also, frankly, I mean, there's a lot of people out there that do things like this. Like, there's a guy actually that I've found. He's actually one of my podcast guests. He runs a fascinating history podcast, deeply fascinating. Real highlight of the thing I've done, for me, is to be exposed to his podcast. And I agree with you. I agree that, we need to have socialization. But I also think that administratively, this is where the universities want to go. And maybe not even they want to go. Maybe they're being dragged that way.
Well, yeah, I mean, they're being dragged that way because they're being forced to be run like businesses. And I think that that's actually like deeply wrong and kind of toxic and really destructive to what universities can and should be. I mean, that's very off topic from my channel, but I actually think that's.
And again, we agree. I mean, I'm totally in agreement with that. But I'm on academic Twitter, and good Lord, some of the stories. Wow. But okay, tell me, what would motivate somebody to be more conservative, say, from a political psychological standpoint?
Yeah, so there's a number of things that do that. So one of them is right-wing authoritarianism. So that's sort of a set of personality traits that cause someone to essentially to want everything sort of very tightly controlled and orderly and conformist, if that makes sense, and also has big emphasis on sort of purity and control and tradition and that sort of stuff. That's where a lot of the sort of social conservative attitudes come from, and that tends to come with very strong like in-group biases. So that's often also the root of a lot of racism and other forms of bigotry, homophobia, that kind of thing, slut shaming, all that. A lot of that stuff is very closely related to right-wing authoritarianism. Also, that can be very related to authoritarianism is the name, so the desire for a very sort of strong leader comes in there, and real fear of disorder is very closely tied to right-wing authoritarianism. You also get social dominance orientation, so that's the belief that the world is and should be a hierarchy, right? So it's sort of the opposite of egalitarianism as a set of attitudes. And, there are a lot of people out there who genuinely believe that the world should not be equal, right? And the idea of making things more equal is genuinely frightening for them. So that motivates a lot of conservative attitudes.
Why would that be frightening? I have two questions, and they might actually be the same question, so just bear with me.
Yeah.
Why would somebody be frightened by equality, number one, and number two, or 1B, right? How would that show up in non-political ways?
Yeah.
In somebody's life.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So one reason that people might be frightened by equality is that they're someone who has a really strong desire to be on the top. So that's not necessarily so much fear as real dislike for equality. But it's not just the desire to be on the top. Sometimes it's the belief that the people who are on the top should be there. It also comes back to this sort of fear of chaos and fear of change. Fear of change is a really big thing in conservatives. And that comes back to another thing I was going to talk about, which is system justification, which is basically a bunch of your brain forcing itself through a bunch of logical hoops to make the current world seem good. And being very high in system justification makes you sort of fearful of change in general. In terms of why people dislike equality, it's actually like this is not something that it's super clear why that's the case. But I think a lot of it has to do with the idea of some people are very against the idea of people getting things they don't deserve, right? Even if everyone's getting it. Some people are very oriented around, they just want everyone to get what they need, right? But there are some people who are very sort of motivated by their own particular concepts of justice that have a real problem with the idea of people getting things they don't deserve, right? Which is where you get the concept of like the welfare queen or something, which doesn't even really exist, but people are really afraid of that sort of thing. So that's sort of the fear of equality thing, and how that comes back in people's lives. It definitely plays into the way people will behave in like a workplace. Very much. A lot of the time, people who are very high in social dominance orientation are people who are very oriented around, climbing the corporate ladder or, giving more respect to people who are higher up in it. Also, I believe that social dominance orientation is slightly higher prevalence in men. And I would be not remotely surprised if it also reflected itself in interpersonal relationships and romantic relationships, but that's not something that I'm really an expert in, so I don't want to talk out of my ass here. I don't have a study for that.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
No, it just occurred. It just strikes me that how I've lived through so much change, not just political change, but technological change.
Mm-hmm.
And I think now we're seeing that can be disruptive to various orders, be it economic, be it social, be it hierarchical, but whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that can be really disconcerting on just even basic levels, just basic, how somebody can. There's actually a thing on Hulu. For example, let me give you an example. There's a documentary on Hulu, or a docuseries on Hulu, about this kid that's an Instagram star, and the parents have to deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
And in my, talking to people all over the place, the thing that we talk about, the thing that gets talked about a lot, is how they have a channel, or they have a YouTube or whatever, and they get recognized, or they get talked to just out in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And one guy said, it's strange how you end up identifying with somebody like Kevin Hart in weird ways, because here I am trying to do something, and this just normal person, this other person, just comes up to me and they want to have a conversation with me, and I'm trying to do whatever they were trying to do. And that's just really disruptive. But also, you think about last year with the various demonstrations or riots or whatever you want to call that, and you think about how a lot of that went viral, and you think about how, I don't know if you have Twitter,
I don't have Twitter. I can't stand it.
Twitter's
I've Instagram and Reddit, but I don't do Twitter.
Twitter's amazing. No, I don't work for Twitter, but Twitter's amazing. But there's all these videos on Twitter about how you're really seeing how people are in the grocery store or how people are in society, right?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that can have disastrous impacts on that person's job.
Mm-hmm.
And the more I think about that, the more I'm like, okay, this person was just trying to get grapefruits, right? They were just trying to get vegetables,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and we don't know if they had a terrible day and now they don't have a job. So it's like we live in this world now where you've always got to be on your best behavior. And that's just not.
Well, I mean, I think that, etiquette is something that's constantly being renegotiated in a society, right? And that, the etiquette gets renegotiated differently around new technologies, and that's something that we're seeing, but we're seeing it at a very fast pace. And so a lot of people, find that alarming,
And
it's not something I'm personally paranoid about. I mean, for one thing, I don't show my face on my channel, and I don't have that many subscribers. So other than the people I know in my real life who know I have a channel, right? No one's going to know anything, right?
That's probably a good thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't know. It's, I mean, people have, I don't know. I just sort of think that, I mean, the technology stuff is complicated. And back what you said about people finding, change alarming is absolutely a very natural human instinct to find change alarming. The issue with that is that it does tend to have sort of a more negative emotional reaction to change in people who are more conservative. And often that can get capitalized on by very bigoted people or movements that change. And so that can be a really big problem.
Yeah. What about so okay, do you feel comfortable telling people maybe not where you went to school, but like where that place was, like in the world?
Oh yeah, sure. I can give out countries. I just don't give out like the name of the school.
Okay. Yeah. So, and obviously you're an American.
Yeah.
So, but you went to, where did you go to school? Like what country?
So I did my undergraduate in Scotland, and then I did a master's degree in England.
Okay. Now, when you were in England, that doesn't really count, right? Because you were just online.
Although I was living there.
Okay.
Yeah, I actually lived in the UK from when I was 18 until a few months ago.
All right. So let me ask you that. So that gets around to this question. Is there a difference in the political psychology between Scotland and England and in the United States?
I would say that there's more difference in the politics than there is in the psychology, right?
Okay.
I mean, people are shaped by their cultures and their environments, absolutely. And there's a huge problem in political psychology, which is that most of the research is done in America and in some instances like Western Europe and like Australia. And there's going to be a lot of cultural differences outside of that sphere and even between those countries. So that, it's hard to get wide applicability. But I personally find that it's more that the psychology is pretty similar in the UK and the US. People are pretty similar. I basically think of British people as if you slammed a bunch of Americans into a smaller, older place. And then, but because the idea that they're like more civil and more classy is nonsense. But the politics are different, very different, right? So, I mean, Scottish politics are quite different because politics there don't necessarily operate on the same left-right divide because you have a lot of stuff that's oriented around like Scottish independence issues. And also, of course, in a parliamentary system, you have, in your for your parliamentary seat, which parties have an actual chance. It's not always going to be the same two parties, right? So that can really alter politics because, where I used to live in Scotland was the main contest was between the Lib Dems, the Liberal Democrats, and the SNP. And now that's the Scottish National Party. Now, people who actually know a bunch about Scottish politics, which doesn't include me, will be able to tell you that those parties differ a great deal on issues other than Scottish independence. But coming at it from an outside perspective, the main difference is Scottish independence. And there's not like an analogous issue to that in the US, right? So the politics are very different. Also, I found that, do you know what an Overton window is?
I do, but why don't you tell my my listeners
Okay,
what an
cool. Yeah.
Overton
So
window is?
Overton window is basically like the range, usually from left to right, but it could be, I guess, on some other spectrum of sort of acceptable, reasonable seeming political discourse, right? And I find
so the Overton window means that, like, for example, maybe not. What would be gay marriage, the classic example, gay marriage moved in the Overton window, right?
Yeah, I mean, at some point, I don't know exactly when it would have been unreasonable to be in favor of it. I think the point at which you would be considered insane for being in favor of it was probably before I was politically active, right? Because I'm 23.
Was. I mean,
yeah, but there's obviously
spoiler alert, I'm older than you. I remember when to be for gay marriage was political suicide. Be it on the left or the right. It just a state of fact. Yeah. And now we've moved in the Overton window.
Yeah, and now it is something that is considered reasonable. But what I was going to say is in the UK, I feel like the Overton window is on a lot of things, especially more economic things, is farther to the left than it is in the US. And especially than it was in the US, when I was last living here, when I was in like high school. You know what I mean? I feel like the Overton window in the US has weirdly sort of widened in both directions. Yeah.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, but I feel like, especially, in like 2016 when I moved there, in the UK, there were especially certain issues where the Overton window is much, farther to the left, right? Like they've had universal health care for many, many years, right? Like a very, very long time.
Since the 50s, right?
Yeah, I think so. Like a very, very long time. And I think, and they're saying that you shouldn't have universal health care, even if you're on the right, is basically a form of political suicide, right? Like there are people on the right who will think that you should fund it less or like maybe have people pay a little bit more of their own healthcare costs, but no one's talking about getting rid of it. But in the US, suggesting a system like the NHS, even the NHS is interpreted through like the Tory party, would be considered a pretty left-wing position, right? So, the Overton window, what seems reasonable or unreasonable varies a fair amount by country. But I find that the people are mostly, where the brains are the same, right? So it's just environment, right? And I think outside of the politics, there aren't maybe that much of cultural differences between the UK and the US that it shapes the politics that much. Although keep in mind that I'm from the Northeast, which is probably the part of the U.S. that's most similar to the U.K. I feel like if I was from California, I'd probably be experiencing, more cultural differences. And there are definitely cultural differences. I just don't necessarily feel like that not asking people about their day in shops is going to influence politics that much.
Well, I think I see a lot of differences. I was actually talking about this at supper. I'm from the South, so the last meal of the day is called supper. I was actually talking about this, that I think this whole technological revolution has showed Americans that we are different. We have very different attitudes about
Oh yeah, no, I wasn't meaning.
things and stuff.
Oh yeah, no, Americans are very different. I wasn't really trying to suggest that they were the same. Just that
Mm,
the elements of the psychology that get applied to politics, even if it's different politics, are fairly similar. That's all.
mm,
Yeah.
mm.
No, but definitely there are cultural differences.
Well, right. But I was talking, I mean, not just, northeast to southeast or east to west or whatever. I was talking like urban versus rural. And
Mm,
just there's some real differences. Um, you know, that I've begun to think are not cosmetic and are very genuine. As,
definitely,
as
yeah.
you know.
Oh yeah, no, that's definitely true. And you do actually see, both because those environments shape people and because people with different personalities want to live in different environments, you do see personality variations with geography, which
Mm.
is a fascinating thing.
How
And
much?
that gets reflected in politics a bit.
Yeah. How much? How much stock do you put in the whole like self-selecting? Like somebody might select themselves to, or somebody might gravitate more towards Florida because they're this kind of conservative versus say Texas, or like how much stock do you put in that? Like somebody saying, "Oh, I want to be with people who vote like me, so I'm going to move to I'm going to move from Maine to Texas, or I'm going to move from Connecticut to Oklahoma."
I don't know. I think it's more like wanting to be with people that think like you, right? Um,
Uh-huh.
and are going to respect you rather than specifically people who vote like you. I just feel like it then, but then, people who think similarly and, respect the similar points of view or identities are probably going to, vote pretty similarly too,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
like, uh,
Mm.
if you're gay or something, you're probably not going to live in a part of the country that's especially homophobic, but you're also probably not going to vote for a party that's especially homophobic, right? So there's sort of selection both coming from the same thing, but not necessarily that you want to live around,
Right.
people of the same political party,
At
right?
at what point did did think like me and vote like me become, because I would think now they're pretty much linked, but maybe they weren't linked in the past?
Uh,
Or do you know what I'm saying? Like,
no, I get what you're saying. So political psychology is a relatively new field.
mhm.
Uh, and a lot of the stuff that got done very early on is sort of quackery. So it's not super useful. And so as far back as I can think, a lot of it is, so think like me, if we're talking, personality variables or whatever, or values tend to
Mhm.
relate very heavily to politics. Um, there is a very famous study by Converse from, I want to say, the 60s, which indicated that a lot of people sort of couldn't tell the difference between Democrats and Republicans ideologically. But I think that was sort of a particular blip in politics. I believe this was the early 60s, but I'd have to check. Um, and that result has not really been replicated. So it might have been true at the very particular time where he was doing it, but it is not generally considered to be true for most of the time after. So, I mean, I think that people with different politics thinking differently is fairly common, right? Um, and I mean, I'm
You
I'm 23, so I don't remember the time where we allegedly all got along. You know what I'm saying? I'm willing to believe that it might have existed. I just don't remember it.
I actually remember it. Like I actually remember it in my actual life.
Yeah.
And what I was going to say was I actually remember when that stopped. Like I actually remember the point where that stopped. And I think the difference, I think the difference became. Well, let me ask you this, Abby.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any literature about, or have you seen any? Because I'm sure there is. When they quit doing earmarks in the Senate, okay?
Yeah, that's
When,
going to be like that's a bit more public policy
yeah.
oriented than is my area of
So,
expertise.
so it doesn't really link. So your expertise doesn't link up um, the thinking with the results.
It does to some extent, but a lot more of it is oriented around voters than politicians themselves. Or the stuff about politicians themselves is it tends to be a bit broader a lot of the time. Yeah, than specifically things
How
like
about
earmarks.
like high trust voters and low trust voters, that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's something that gets talked about. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So you were telling me like off air, you were telling me like high trust voters, there's a lot tend to vote to the left, and or what was it exactly you
That was
said?
honesty. I was talking about honesty, not trust.
Yeah. Okay. So
People who have a more honest personality type, as measured by the Hexaco scale, tend to be more left-wing voting.
that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
That is so. Tell me about that.
Well, it's honestly a little unclear why, or at least I'm not an expert on why. But generally speaking, people who are higher in the honesty dimension when it comes to personality are tend to vote more left wing. I think part of it might be that the general idea that people are sort of guardedness and the idea that people are out to get you is very related to being more right wing. The idea that the world is dangerous is relating to being more right wing. I mean, that's not the same thing though as honesty, right? But I think that, I mean, if you'll excuse the rudeness, a certain amount of selfishness comes with both dishonesty and that. If I had to guess, but it's not a topic that I'm massively an expert on, and so I don't want to be, like I said, I don't want to be talking out of my ass there.
No, I get that. That is fascinating though, because now how does that relate when we think about COVID? How does that relate
Yeah, I
when we
mean,
think about COVID?
well, I actually, yeah, so part of it is that people, Uh, so there's this idea that one of the more effective ways to deal with the pandemic is to view it as a communal issue, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because any individual's odds of getting sick and dying are pretty low, especially if you're young and healthy. But it's a devastating thing for a community, right?
Mm-hmm.
But both propagating and responding to communal messaging is a really difficult thing for conservatives. And honestly, not the easiest thing for liberals in this country, right?
Why
Because
is it so hard for conservatives?
well, because
Because you're right, but why is that hard?
because it tends to have a worldview that's very oriented around self-interest, right? If you have a political ideology that's very built around not building social safety nets and everybody looking out for themselves, then that's not super well suited to a problem that has to be tackled communally, right? Yeah, so that's a real issue.
Or
And
like, or
also,
like if I had a dollar, I'm sorry, but like if I had a dollar for every conservative that ever told me I don't want to live in a society. Like their fantasy is to not live in a society.
Yeah.
Some people. Yeah.
No, I mean, that is a thing for some people. And I mean, I find that baffling. I'm a very people, I'm a very people should be interdependent type person. I mean, that's one of the reasons I got into social psychology.
I don't know that I'm a should there, but I am and is there. Like I might not be a should, but I am like that is.
Yeah, that is reality, but
know.
it's a reality that a lot of people want to deny, if that makes sense.
Well, right, because I've studied I've studied this country for a long time, and we're a rapidly urbanizing society. And let me ask you, let me ask you this. Have you seen any research in the political psychology of urban voters versus rural voters?
A little bit, but not a ton. I mean, it's basically what you'd think with urban voters tend to be more left leaning.
As far as more like the urban voters tend to be more social contracty. And I don't just mean like center city voters or whatever. I mean like people living in built up areas.
Yeah,
tend to be more social contracty.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. You kind of have to be, otherwise things fall apart, right? You got to look out for each other to some extent. Yeah. And I mean, I live in a city now, and that is actually something I really like about it. I grew up in the suburbs, and I just found it way too atomized.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Let me ask, living in the UK, did you notice any difference in how the UK people look at things like traffic versus how Americans do, or whatever? Well, there's a reason I'm asking.
Yeah, well, I mean, they have a ton of roundabouts, like traffic circles. They're crazy about traffic circles.
Yeah.
Also, in my experience, the public transit is better. Yeah.
The reason,
which I'm a big fan of public transit, so that is something I like.
Well, the reason I'm asking is because of this. When I first went to college in a small town, in a what we call an exurban county, wasn't even suburban. You saw a lot of people intentionally flouting traffic laws. Like a lot of that. Like, they weren't stopping at the stop sign. They were going to run the red light. They were going to drive on the wrong side of the road on purpose because the government was telling them to do that. And, blah, blah. And I'm just thinking that has to feed into their psychology of how they vote.
Yeah, I mean, there is a, there is a certain, hatred of the government that is instilled, especially in, conservative and rural populations. And the thing is that does serve certain interests, right? That's going to serve the interests of the Republican Party, even though they're part of the government, because disliking and distrusting the government is part of their platform, disliking and distrusting the government is going to serve them. It also serves the interests of people who don't want to pay a lot of taxes and therefore would like small government, right? So even though, having a government that does more might help the average, working class person in a rural area, if they can be convinced that that's not in their interests, right, then that's going to help someone who's real rich. And the same goes for businesses, right? If they can convince, if a business that might actually be directly, polluting and essentially poisoning people in a rural area can convince the people in that rural area or other rural areas across the country that the EPA is, tyrannical and coming to take their rights, then that really works in their favor, right? Yeah. So, distrust of certain authorities and trust of others, it's a power play, right?
Absolutely. No, it absolutely is.
Yeah.
And that's just so like, I've had several people on, and we would talk about, in fact, one guy was pretty famous, and he's been on much, much bigger podcasts than me. And I didn't release his episode because I take COVID-19 seriously, and I take my COVID-19 episodes seriously, very seriously. And he saw COVID as, he was very on brand, let's say that, about how he saw COVID. And I did not like how he was using my show to, further a political brand.
Yeah.
Around, I'm willing to let people die so I can busily not be elected to public office because I'm never going to win public office because of where I live. But I can run for it. And I really didn't like that he was using me for that.
Yeah, you don't have to platform people like that, and that's I admire that.
and I didn't.
Yeah.
The thing I wanted to say was I've talked to a lot of right-leaning people, and the thing they always keep saying is, mask mandates or tyranny or whatever. And it's interesting how many of these people, it's fascinating to me how many of these people claim to not be vaccinated for anything.
Yeah.
And somehow I know that's not true. Like, somehow, because I'm as old as I am, I know if you are varnished by education at all, you had to be vaccinated for measles.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know that.
Yeah, what I was gonna say about the mask mandates and that sort of thing is I think that that comes in again with the fear of change, I think, to some extent, and it is unpleasant and inconvenient, I don't like wearing a mask. I don't think anyone really does.
Hey, I have the 15th most listened to podcast on COVID in the world, and I'm going to say right now, I don't like wearing a mask at all.
Yeah, that's why everyone should go get vaccinated, so we don't have to do that anymore. Anyway, yeah. Yeah. What I was going to say is that, it's people who don't like law and order as it's applied to them, right? Because a lot of these people who are, anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers and think that the government's being real tyrannical to them for making them wear a little piece of, fabric on their face. A lot of them will, be very, very opposed to, say, the Black Lives Matter movement and very, very pro-police, right? But they don't want to be policed. They want other people to be policed. And then I was also going to say that, like, it's weird what, it's because of what people are used to, right? There's a literature that shows that something is viewed as much more legitimate when it's already happened and when it's already been a thing for a long time, right? Like, I seriously doubt that most of these anti-mask people would support my right as a woman to go topless, right? And if I went topless, right, that wouldn't directly hurt anyone, unlike people not wearing a mask.
I read a fascinating article very recently about seatbelt laws. And how recently seatbelt laws became literally the law of the land everywhere.
Yeah.
Like I remember being a child and you'd hear people of an age gripe about wearing a seatbelt, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I had no idea that it was into the 90s.
Yeah,
I had no idea.
that's not good. Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah. Yeah. Huh.
yeah. But it's, people eventually accept things. But I don't think that we as a society have to accept wearing masks forever if people get vaccinated. Um, you know,
Well, and one thing I will say, honestly, as somebody who keeps up with COVID, is it's disturbing to me how many punch through COVID cases there really are. Um, like it's really disturbing to me.
yeah, but it's a such a lower rate than with unvaccinated people, and they tend to be much milder cases. But it's really hard to communicate this to the public, right? People have a tremendous amount of difficulty processing large numbers and probability, but they have a really easy time processing notable stories, right?
Well, I also think a lot of it has to do with. I have this theory, and my theory is that in the day and age of I can text you, like if I had your phone number,
Mm-hmm.
right? I could text you a movie, literally.
Mm-hmm.
Like I could text you a movie and you could watch it on your phone.
Mm-hmm.
I think in the day and age of that, if you had Ebola here, right, people would get on board with being treated for Ebola real quick, really quick, because you'd see it. It'd be in public,
Mm.
right? You would see, hey man, let me text you this picture of this dude or this person who has Ebola in the waiting room in Target or whatever, right? And you'd be like, oh my God, let me go get vaccinated, right? The problem with COVID is that you die in private.
Yeah, I think that you're very right about that, right? Because it's less visceral, especially, for someone my age, where most of the people,
Mm.
who are dying aren't going to be people that directly, like the people I know of who have, died and who are in all really to me is like the grandparent of one of my friends and then one of my grandmother's friends, right? And obviously that's awful, but neither of these people are people who I know very well, right?
Maybe
Um,
I'm just weird
I was,
because go ahead.
but what I was going to say is I absolutely agree because I, I think, I think that the fact that people don't see it, right, is a huge part of things. And I think that, a lot of the denialism or the anti-mask stuff comes from the fact that people see the limitations that the response to the pandemic has put on their lives every day, but they don't see the pandemic every day. You know what I
And
mean?
they're also connecting up the fact that like the grocery store ran out of carrots. Like my grocery store ran out
Oh,
of carrots. Or what's another one? They connect up the fact that I've seen photos on Twitter of like entire egg cases empty. Like there's no eggs.
yeah,
Or like they connect that up with the pandemic when that's really a supply chain issue.
yeah.
Or what's the other one? Um, what's the other one? There's one that I read. The number of cars, the number of new cars that are on sale are just like not what they need to be. But um, and I
And
don't.
then that sort of attitude is going to, feed back into being helpful for corporate interests that want people to go back to work in crowded factories and that kind of thing and farms.
Hmm. Well, I think I see a phenomenon in my city that I'm just like, this is really strange. Like, I see a phenomenon practically every day that I'm like, okay, I'm a smart guy and I can't get down to the bottom of this. I'll see more traffic than I ever used to see, right? But when you look out, when you look on the road, either side of the road, what you don't see is you don't see the corresponding people in the parking lot, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, where are these people going? That's what I don't get.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is it that we're meeting in people's houses to do work? Is that the deal? Or I don't know the answer to that.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Abby, what do you think from a political, psychological standpoint, where do you think the American electorate's going?
Well, I can't make a prophecy here, but I think that the Republican Party at this point is sustaining itself on a combination of, honestly, business interests that don't know what's good for them, because at this point it's not even good for business, the Republican ideology, but certain business interests in rich people and bigotry. And I don't see a rise of some sort of reasonable conservatism in the future. So I see this from a lot of liberals who are like, oh, if we could have, reasonable Republicans to be up against again. Nah, let the Republican Party die and try and kill it. But and then I see the Democratic Party. My hope is that it drifts further left, or that, 40, 50 years from now, the Republican Party dies completely and the Democratic Party splits in half, with a more left-wing party and a more party where it is sort of right now. And I think that the thing is with the way things are now is people aren't happy with politics being the way they are now and with the world being the way it is now. And, if nothing is done, things are only going to get worse because of things like climate change, right? So you can have real solutions to this sort of stuff, and I don't see any of those coming from the right anytime soon.
Let me ask you this.
Oh,
well,
sorry.
Go ahead. But there's another. There was something that literally hit me like a 2x4 a couple of months ago, maybe 3 months ago. I was looking at there's all these people now, even now, who deny COVID is real, right? And I'm out here going, I could see it. I could literally see like something bad happening, like something climate changey bad happening to some low-lying place in America.
Mm-hmm.
And I could literally see a certain given number of folks denying that it happened.
Mm-hmm.
Or you would see people like, I don't care. I don't want to pay for that.
Mm-hmm.
And if I step back and think about, like, if I objectify what's going on in our culture, I really think there needs to be a place for people. And I don't mean I mean like an ideological place. There needs to be a place for people who honestly want to be left alone. They truly, honestly don't want to be involved in society at all. And
in politics or in society overall?
Well, in politics, but because I've talked to a lot of people, and I've talked to people that I don't agree with at all, politically speaking, right? But I can kind of get where they're coming from. That they managed to live this life in this little small town, and they have this job, and and they have their house and their thing and and they don't want to care. They honestly don't want to care about whatever. Like whatever I think or whatever, somebody might think. They just want to live their little life and not be bothered. And I kind of get that. Like,
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. Like,
yeah, I mean, that is sort of where I would take the stance of I would rather someone not vote than vote wrong. But
well, yeah, I mean,
but I mean, I do think that it is, it is that being politically engaged either comes from, being politically disengaged either comes from, real disillusionment with the political process, real giving up on it, or enough privilege to not care, right? And I'm not saying everyone has to be involved, but from people who are coming up from the perspective where they've just given up on the political process, nothing's going to change if you're not involved, right? But if you just don't care, well, then you're allowed to not care. You know what I mean?
well, right. Okay, Abby, just hang on the line while I unhook the recording. And before I do that, was there anything you wanted to tell the internet before we?
Yeah. If you want to check out my YouTube channel, it's let me just pull up so I can tell people the link. Right. You can edit this out, right?
Oh, I'll put it in the description, and I am gonna edit this podcast.
Oh, okay, good. I assumed you were.
Absolutely.
Okay, good. Should I say the link too, or you'll just put it in the description?
I'll put it in the description. I'll absolutely put it in the description.
Okay.
Mm.
All right. Yeah, that's the main thing.
I'll put it in the description, and just say the name of your podcast so we can. My bad. Okay, let me do that again. Say the name of your YouTube channel so people can know what it is.
It's Political Psych with Abby.
Okay. All right. And well, thank you for coming on the History Voyager.